The signature line was a clean, black rule printed above the words Eleanor Vance, Grantor. Catherine Vance, CPA, tapped a manicured finger beside it. The pen, a heavy silver instrument bearing the bank's logo, sat precisely parallel to the stack of documents. It was the only thing on the polished mahogany table that seemed to have any weight. Everything else, the papers, the quietly humming lights, the faint scent of air freshener and old money, felt thin, unreal. The room was designed for silent agreement, a place where futures were tidied up and locked into place with the smooth click of a pen. It was a room that assumed a conclusion. Catherine spoke. Her voice was the same one she used for quarterly earnings calls, calm, certain, with a faint, pleasant hum of finality. "And that's the last one, Mum. Just sign here, then it's all taken care of." She smiled. It was a professional smile, one that didn't quite reach the cool grey of her eyes. It was a smile that expected compliance. It had been expecting it for the last hour, through a dozen similar pages, each one a neat legal brick, walling off Eleanor's past from her future. A future Catherine had designed. Eleanor Vance did not look at the signature line. Her gaze was fixed on the silver pen. It was the kind of object her husband, Robert, would have distrusted, too slick, too heavy for its purpose. Her own hands, resting on the worn leather of her handbag, were not made for things like that. They were hands that knew the grit of soil, the heft of a feed bucket, the splintered handle of a shovel. They were weathered, but clean. Her knuckles were maps of a life spent doing, not directing. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she opened her handbag. The clasp made a small, solid click in the quiet room. The sound was defiant. Catherine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A small line appeared between her eyebrows. The bank officer, a young man named Davis, whose suit was a size too big, shifted in his chair. He had been a silent, nodding witness for the entire meeting, a piece of the room's furniture. Now he leaned forward slightly, his institutional calm disturbed by that small, unexpected sound. From the bag, Eleanor withdrew a single envelope. It was long and brown, the colour of weak tea. The paper was brittle at the edges, the corners soft with age. It had no window. The address was typed, faded, but legible. A postmark from a town that no longer had its own post office. The date on the stamp was from 1980. She laid it on top of the glossy, freshly printed trust agreement. The contrast was stark. The old, fragile paper resting on the crisp, modern one. It was a quiet, physical contradiction. "Mum, what is that?" Catherine's voice held a new note. Not alarm, not yet. It was the carefully modulated patience of a professional dealing with an unexpected and likely irrelevant piece of data. "We're finished with the paperwork. We just need your signature." "This came first," Eleanor said. Her voice was low, but it filled the space the way a slow water leak fills a cellar. Quietly, but with undeniable presence. She did not look at her daughter. She looked at the envelope. It had waited a long time. The bank officer, Davis, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Vance, the documents Miss Vance has prepared are to establish a secure trust for your assets. It's for your protection." He spoke the words as if from a script. He was trying to restore the room's intended purpose, to smooth over the interruption. Catherine reached for the envelope, but Eleanor placed her hand flat upon it. A simple gesture. A claim. The work boots she wore were clean, but a faint line of pale dust was visible on the cuffs of her slacks just above the worn leather. Her shirt was pressed. She was a woman who presented herself with care, but who did not try to hide where she came from. The dust was part of the story. "I think," Eleanor said, her voice unchanged, "you need to see what's inside." The room went quiet. The humming light seemed louder now. The silver pen lay untouched. The signature line waited, empty.
A question had been placed on the table, disguised as a piece of old mail, and the conclusion the room had assumed was suddenly no longer certain. It was an interruption, a pause in a story that everyone but Eleanor thought was already over. Some men collect problems. Robert Vance had collected patience. He had planted it in the thin soil of a bad investment and left it for his wife to harvest, decades later, in a cold room with a mahogany table. To understand the envelope, you have to go back, not just to 1980, but to the kitchen where the decision was made. You have to go back to the man who made it. Robert Vance was a quiet man.
The kind of quiet that comes from listening more than speaking. He had run the farm with Eleanor for 40 years. She knew the land, the sky, the seasons. He knew the numbers. He kept them in green ledgers, written in a neat, compact hand. Every expense, every sale, every tax payment. His books were a testament to a life of careful measure. In 1978, the talk in town was all about the Clear Creek Agricultural Co-op. It was a new idea. Farmers pooling their resources to build their own grain elevator, cutting out the middlemen. It promised independence. It promised a better price. It was a story of self-reliance, the kind of story Robert believed in. He and Eleanor talked it over at the kitchen table for weeks. The coffee pot was always on. The sun would set over the west field, painting the room in soft light. It was their place, their boardroom. "It's a lot of money, Robert," she'd said, tracing the rim of her coffee cup.
"It's an investment in us," he answered, "in all of us."
He believed it. He saw the logic. He trusted the men involved. They were his neighbours, men he'd known his whole life. So he took a second mortgage on a piece of land they owned free and clear. He invested the full amount, $215,000. It was a staggering sum then. It was everything they had, and then some. For a year, it looked like the smartest decision he had ever made. The elevator went up, a proud concrete promise on the horizon. Then, in late 1979, the trouble started. A manager who cooked the books, a bad loan, commodity prices that fell through the floor. The details were complicated, a slow, ugly tangle of mistakes and misfortunes. The result was simple. The Clear Creek Co-op went bankrupt. The promise on the horizon became a monument to failure. The money was gone. All of it. The shame nearly broke him. Robert Vance was a man who paid his debts.
To have a debt this large, one that could never be repaid, settled on him like a physical weight. He stooped a little more, the lines around his eyes deepened. He never spoke of it as a bad decision, he spoke of it as his failure. "I lost it," he would say. "I lost the money." He told Catherine the same thing. She was in high school then, already smart with numbers, already seeing the world in columns of profit and loss. She saw her father's pain, and she interpreted it as weakness, a lack of foresight, a financial incompetence that she would spend her life making sure she never repeated. The story of the lost $215,000 became the foundational myth of their family. It was the reason Catherine became a CPA. It was the reason she believed, with absolute certainty, that her mother needed her protection. She was saving her from her father's legacy. Robert spent the next year dealing with the fallout. Lawyers, accountants, the IRS. He handled it all himself at the same kitchen table. Late at night, under a single bare bulb, he would sit with his papers, his green ledger, and his quiet grief. Eleanor would bring him coffee. She never blamed him. She knew the man, not just the mistake. One night, he looked up at her, his face pale with exhaustion. "It's done," he said. "They accepted it. The loss is declared." That was that. He closed the ledger. They worked for the next 20 years to pay off the second mortgage. They lived carefully. They saved what they could. The lost money was a ghost in their house, a constant reminder of what could have been. Robert died 2 years ago.
He died in the same house, in the same bed he'd shared with Eleanor for half a century. He left her the farm, a small life insurance policy, and his green ledgers. 3 months before the meeting in the mahogany room, Eleanor had finally decided it was time to clean out his desk. It was a small, roll-top desk in a corner of the spare bedroom. It was his space.
She hadn't touched it since he passed. The grief was still too fresh. But Catherine was pressuring her about the trust, about getting her affairs in order. So, one Tuesday morning, she opened the desk. The smell of old paper and cedarwood filled the air. It smelled like him. She ran her hand over the smooth, worn wood. She started sorting. Old receipts, manuals for tractors they no longer owned, canceled checks from the 1970s. It was a slow, deliberate process. Each paper was a memory. She found a shoebox tied with twine. On the side, in Robert's neat hand, it said, "Taxes, final." Inside were folders for each year, 1978, 1979, 1980. She opened the 1980 folder. It was thick with forms and worksheets. Tucked in the middle, in its own envelope, was the letter. It was from the State Department of Revenue. The letterhead was simple, the typing clear. It was an audit notification. Her heart sank for a moment. Another problem from the past.
But as she read, the words didn't sound like a problem. It was formal, dry, procedural. It referenced the bankruptcy of the Clear Creek Agricultural Co-op. It referenced their tax filing for the 1979 fiscal year, and it stated in plain bureaucratic language that the declared partnership loss of $215,000 was verified and accepted. The audit was closed. She folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. She didn't fully understand what it meant, not then. But she knew Robert's precision. He had labelled the box final. This letter was the final word on the matter. It was the end of that story. She put the envelope in her handbag and left it there, a piece of her husband's carefulness waiting for the right moment. It felt like a duty. It felt like honouring his memory, his quiet diligence in the face of failure. She didn't know it was evidence. She just knew it was the truth. The truth lay on the table between them. Catherine looked from her mother's hand resting on the envelope to her mother's face. Eleanor's expression was calm. It was the same look she had when she was watching a storm roll in from the west. Not fear, not defiance, just observation, a deep and patient waiting. "Mum, this is from 1980, Catherine said, her voice tight with forced reasonableness. "It's an old tax document. It has nothing to do with setting up a trust in the present day." She was trying to re-establish the frame. She was the expert. This was her arena. The mahogany table, the legal documents, the financial planning. This was the world she had mastered, a world far from the dust and uncertainty of the farm. She was on solid ground here. Eleanor did not move her hand. "It's about the co-op," she said. A flicker of irritation crossed Catherine's face. "Yes, Dad's bad investment. The money he lost. That's the whole reason we're here. To make sure your assets are professionally managed so that doesn't happen again."
So you're protected.
The word hung in the air. Protected. It was the word Catherine had used all along. It was the foundation of her entire argument. She was the protector. Her mother was the one who needed protecting. From the world, from her own financial naivety, from the echoes of her husband's mistakes. "He didn't lose the money," Eleanor said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a gavel. Catherine laughed. It was a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Of course he did. He always said he did. We lost everything on that deal. We spent 20 years paying for it." "We spent 20 years paying off the loan," Eleanor corrected her, her voice still level. "That's different. The investment itself wasn't lost. It was converted." The bank officer Davis was watching Eleanor now. He was no longer looking at Catherine for his cues. The certainty in the room had fractured. He was a man who dealt in numbers, in assets and liabilities.
The idea of a sum as large as $215,000 being misunderstood for 40 years was both terrifying and fascinating. It went against the ordered principles of his profession. Converted to what? Catherine challenged, her tone sharpening. She finally slid the envelope out from under her mother's hand and opened it. Her eyes scanned the page, her training as a CPA taking over. She read it quickly, then again, slower. Her expression didn't change, but a subtle tension entered her jaw. She was processing. She was looking for the flaw, the loophole, the reason this old piece of paper was irrelevant. It was a capital loss, she said, setting the letter down. She was on familiar ground again, tax law. A partnership capital loss. He wrote it off against income back then, I'm sure.
It would have been used up in a few years. She looked at Davis, seeking an ally. That's how it worked. He didn't have any other income to write it off against, Eleanor said. The farm barely broke even those years. We had the loan to pay. This was the first point that Catherine had not anticipated. Her model of the past had been simpler, a catastrophic loss followed by a long, slow recovery. She had never considered the specific tax implications. She had never looked at the old ledgers. She had relied on the family story, the myth of the failure. It doesn't matter, Catherine insisted, shifting her line of attack. This was her second angle, the legal argument. Tax laws from 1980 are ancient history. The capital gains regulations, the carry-forward rules, they've all been completely rewritten half a dozen times. There is no way a loss from that long ago could still be active. It's expired.
It's legally meaningless.
She tapped the letter with her finger, dismissing it. This is a historical artifact, not a financial instrument. Eleanor said nothing. She let the silence answer. She had presented her fact. She would not argue its merits. The letter was the truth. It was up to the room to accept it or not. Her stillness was more powerful than any argument. It was a deep-grounded confidence that unnerved her daughter. Catherine was used to debate, to the quick exchange of points and counterpoints. She didn't know how to fight a silence like this. A silence that simply waited. Catherine felt her control of the room slipping. She looked at Davis, who was now staring intently at the audit letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. She looked at her mother, whose calm was impenetrable. She tried a third angle, the emotional one, the one she had been holding in reserve. Her voice softened. "Mum, listen to me. I'm your daughter. I love you. I am a certified public accountant.
My entire career is about protecting people's money. Your money. I have spent months designing this trust to give you security for the rest of your life. All you have to do is trust me, the way you trusted Dad." It was the wrong thing to say. "I do trust him," Eleanor said, a voice finally carrying a hint of steel. "He was a careful man. He paid his debts, and he kept his records. This is his record." She gently took the letter back from Catherine and held it, not as a weapon, but as a testament. The room was at an impasse, a 40-year-old piece of paper against a modern, comprehensive estate plan, a mother's memory against a daughter's expertise. Catherine, flustered and angry now, fell back on the most basic argument of all, practicality. "Fine," she snapped, the professional calm finally breaking. "Let's say you're right. Let's say this tax credit, or whatever you think it is, somehow survived for 40 years. Where is it? Where is the money? It's not in a bank account. It's not in a stock portfolio. It doesn't exist. It's a phantom number on a piece of paper. It's not real." "It's real," Eleanor said, "when you sell the land." A deep silence fell over the room. Davis, the banker, looked up from the letter. His eyes were wide. He understood. He finally understood. Catherine stared at her mother, the full implication of those 5 words dawning on her. The trust she had created, the one that was designed to protect her mother, gave Catherine the authority to sell the farm. The sale would trigger a massive capital gains tax, a tax on the land's appreciation over 60 years. A tax that would consume a huge portion of the proceeds, a tax Catherine had accounted for in her projections. A tax that this letter, this ghost from 1980, might just eliminate entirely. The $215,000 wasn't cash in an account. It was a shield, an invisible asset that only became real at the precise moment the farm was sold.
An asset whose existence would make the sale of the farm vastly more profitable. An asset she, the CPA, the financial expert, had missed completely. Because she had believed the story a failure and had never bothered to check the records. She had assumed. And what everyone assumes is what no one verifies. Mr. Davis cleared his throat. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. All eyes turned to him. He was no longer just a piece of furniture in the room. He was now the fulcrum on which everything balanced. He held the audit letter from 1980 in his hand, his thumb resting near the bottom of the page. He wasn't looking at Catherine. He was looking at Eleanor with a newfound respect. "There's a name here," he said, his voice measured. "The auditor who signed off on this. Howard Gable." He looked up. "I know that name. He retired from the State Revenue Department years ago, but he does private consulting. He's the person they call when the old computer systems don't have the records, and they need someone who just remembers." Catherine saw where this was going. "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "This is a legal matter for the tax attorneys, not a phone call to a retiree." She was trying to pull the situation back into her world, the world of billable hours and formal proceedings, a world she could control. "I think it might be helpful," Davis said gently. It wasn't a suggestion. He was a junior officer, but he was still the bank's representative. He had a duty to the client, and at this moment, it was becoming increasingly unclear who exactly the client was. Was it Catherine, the confident professional who had arranged the meeting? Or was it the quiet old woman with the dusty cuffs and the 40-year-old letter? He was beginning to understand that the real assets in this room were not the ones listed on the trust documents. He picked up the phone on the credenza and dialed a number from his contact list. He did not ask for permission again. He simply acted. "Howard, it's Mark Davis at Sterling Bank. I have a question for you. It's about an old audit. Yes, from 1980. Catherine sat rigid in her chair, her arms crossed. This was a procedural breakdown, an unprofessional detour. She was watching her carefully constructed plan, her entire narrative of parental care, unravel because of a stray piece of paper and a banker who wouldn't follow her lead. Davis put the call on speakerphone. A dry, calm voice, thin with age but clear as a bell, filled the room. 1980. That's digging deep, Mark. What have you got? A state audit letter, Davis said, closing an audit on a partnership loss, the Clear Creek Agricultural Co-op. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It stretched for a few seconds. In the conference room, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the voice came back with a note of recognition. "Oh, yes, the Clear Creek mess. I remember that one. A lot of good people lost their shirts. What's the audit number?" Davis read the number from the top of the letter. Another pause. The sound of a keyboard clicking softly could be heard. "Vance," the voice said. "Robert and Eleanor Vance." "Yes, I've got the file summary here. It was a Section 1231 loss, treated as a capital loss carry forward. He declared the full 215,000. "And the question is," Davis said, choosing his words carefully, "what is the status of that carry forward?" "Well," Gable said, "that depends. Did they have significant income in the following years? Most people with a loss that big would have used it up against gains within a decade. That was the point." "Their income was low," Eleanor spoke up, her voice steady. "The farm wasn't making much."
"We had a loan." The voice on the phone did not miss a beat.
Then it would keep carrying forward. The rules were different then, simpler. There was no expiration date on a loss like that. Not until the filer's death. Another pause. Wait a minute. Robert Vance. He passed a couple of years back, didn't he? Yes, Eleanor said. Then, under the spousal inheritance rules from that era, Gable said, his voice holding the casual certainty of a man who had lived and breathed these regulations for 50 years, the full remaining balance of that capital loss carry forward would have transferred directly to his surviving spouse. To you, Mrs. Vance. It's your asset now, fully vested, as good as cash against any future capital gains. The room went completely still. Done. The single word from a stranger on a telephone had dismantled Catherine's entire case. It had rewritten 40 years of family history. The number wasn't a phantom. It was real. The $215,000 wasn't a story about failure. It was a story about a quiet, diligent man who, in the midst of his greatest financial disaster, had done the paperwork correctly. He had salvaged what he could, not for himself, but for the future. He had planted a tree for the next generation, a tree his own daughter had been preparing to cut down. Catherine's face was a mask of controlled shock. The colour had drained from her cheeks. She was a CPA. Her identity, her professional pride, was built on the foundation of being the one who understood the numbers, the one who saw what others missed, and in the most important financial accounting of her life, her own family's, she had missed the single largest asset. She had been blind to it because she preferred the story of her father's incompetence. It was a story that made her necessary. The truth, it turned out, made her irrelevant. She tried to recover, to reassert control. It was an instinct. Well, she said, her voice brittle, that's an interesting piece of information. A good find, Mum. She tried to smile, to frame this as a collaborative discovery. We'll just need to amend the trust documents to reflect this new asset. We can have my lawyer redraft the... She reached for the stack of papers, the ones Eleanor had yet to sign. Eleanor placed her hand on the stack. The same simple, quiet gesture she had used to protect the envelope. But this time, it was different. It was not a request for attention. It was a final verdict. No, she said. The word was not angry. It was not loud. It was a statement of fact as simple and solid as a fence post. Catherine froze, her hand hovering over the documents. What do you mean, no? We have to account for this. The plan has to be updated. The plan is cancelled, Eleanor said. She began to gather the documents, not with anger, but with a slow, deliberate efficiency. She slid the thick trust agreement, the powers of attorney, the health care directives, all of it, into a neat pile. She did not look at her daughter. She looked at Mr. Davis. Thank you for the phone call, she said to him. It was a dismissal, a recognition that his role, the role of the neutral verifier, was complete. He had done his job. He had held the door open for the truth. Of course, Mrs. Vance, he murmured, looking down at his desk. He was a witness to something profound and painful, a quiet family reckoning that felt far too intimate for the sterile confines of a bank conference room. Eleanor stood up. She slid the neatly stacked papers into her large leather handbag. They disappeared inside, consumed. The brittle envelope with the 1980 audit letter went into a side pocket, separate and safe. She closed the clasp. The click was the only sound. Catherine remained seated, staring at the empty space on the mahogany table where her plan had been. The silver pen was still there, a useless, heavy object. Mum, she said, her voice small now, stripped of its professional authority. Wait. We should talk about this. Eleanor looked at her daughter for the first time since the phone call. She saw not the confident CPA, but the young girl who had been so afraid of the failure she saw in her father. A girl who had built a life around never being him, and in the process had never truly seen him at all. There was no triumph in Eleanor's eyes, only a deep, quiet sorrow, a restrained grief for the years lost to a misunderstanding. She didn't answer, no words, no hesitation. She turned and walked out of the room. Her work boots made no sound on the thick carpet. The door closed softly behind her, the pneumatic hinge sighing as it sealed the room in silence. Catherine Vance, CPA, was left alone at the table with the banker and a silver pen. The institution had gone quiet. The confident smile was gone. The carefully constructed arguments had evaporated. All that was left was the smooth, polished surface of the table, reflecting the empty chair where her mother had sat.
The auction was over. That ended it.
A week later, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the faint swirls of dust dancing in the air. The same window where she and Robert had watched so many sunrises. The same table where he had sat with his ledgers, fighting his quiet battles. A simple ceramic mug of tea steamed in her hands. She was not looking out the window. She was looking at a photograph in a simple wooden frame, a picture of her and Robert, taken at the county fair in 1975. They were young, squinting in the bright sun, his arm around her. They looked happy. They looked like partners. After a long moment, she set the photo aside and pulled a book toward her. It was one of Robert's old green ledgers, blank. He had always bought them 2 at a time. This one had been waiting in the bottom drawer of his desk for 40 years. The pages were crisp, the blue and red lines sharp and clear. She opened it to the first page.
She took a simple ballpoint pen from a jar on the windowsill.
In the first column, she wrote the date. In the second column, the one labeled description, she wrote 2 words: balance, forward. She paused, then moved her pen to the final column, the one for credits, the one for assets. With a steady hand, in Robert's neat, compact style, she wrote the number: $215,000. She looked at the number for a long time. It was not a victory. It was a restoration. Something crooked had been made straight. An old debt of understanding had been paid. She closed the ledger. Done. Some things are planted for the next man, and sometimes the next man is the woman he leaves behind. The truth, it turned out, had its own pace. Eleanor Vance found her balance. But what happens when the document isn't a letter from the government, but a hand-drawn map from a dead surveyor? A map that shows a county road. A road that has been used by the public for a century is not a county road at all.
It's private property, and a developer just broke ground on a new subdivision right in the middle of it. Stay with us. We'll see what holds.